Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Ashley Fortune Isham, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar series that we hold in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, or NISQWSC. They're located in Reston, Virginia. The NISQWSC Climate Change Science and Management webinar series highlights their sponsored science projects related to climate change impacts and adaptation and aims to increase awareness and inform participants like you about potential and predicted climate change impacts on fish and wildlife. Alrighty, so I did just want to welcome Elda Valera Minder, who will be introducing today's speaker. She's a research associate. So welcome, Elda.
Yes, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to welcome our speaker, Jason Dunham. He is an aquatic ecologist with the USGS Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center in Corvallis, Oregon. For his graduate work in the early 1990s, he studied fishes in the Sonoran and Great Basin deserts, and since has expanded his work across the western U.S. and internationally. His current research is focused on climate and land use change, species conservation, biological invasions, and development of tools to engage managers and stakeholders in science applications. Thank you so much, and welcome, Jason.
Thank you very much. Am I good to go?
You are good to go.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, folks, for signing up for the webinar today. It's a real pleasure for me to share this work, and I hope you find it interesting and have some good questions for me at the end. To begin with, I'd like to thank the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center for supporting a good chunk of this work, and also for inviting me to serve on the SNAP Ecological Drought Working Group. It's been a great experience. You'll also see here on the marquee logos from numerous organizations who have all played an important role in the work that I'm going to talk about today, and hopefully I'll do a good job of acknowledging each and every one of them as I go through this. So even if you're not from California, you've probably heard about the California drought. It's been a big deal here out west where I work. I'm in the Forest and Rangeland Ecosystem Science Center in Corvallis, Oregon. And as you can see here from the drought monitor, even in normally wet and cloudy Oregon, we have been experiencing fairly dry conditions in the last several years, sort of peaking in 2015. And this phenomenon is not unique to the West. If you take a look at the drought monitor, this is really a wonderful resource. If you don't visit there, it's kind of interesting to see over time how things come and go nationally. And you can see in the southeast U.S. right now that is starting to get into a drought situation. And across the U.S., things are abnormally dry in a lot of places. So this is something that we're becoming increasingly aware of as the realization that climate change is probably the main driving force behind a lot of these cycles. And here's the story from California. This is a nice sort of summary of what's going on. It's from a paper by Noah Diffenbaugh published in PNAS last year. If you look at the left-hand graph, what you can see is a distribution of points over time arrayed along two axes. One is a temperature anomaly, so warmer up top, cooler below, and the precip anomaly, precipitation, again showing that same sort of gradient. And what you see historically is these points are arrayed more or less evenly across the four quadrants of that plot. If you look at a more recent time series from 1995 to 2014, and this is the modified Palmer Drought Severity Index, but just about any index would probably show this. What you see is an increasing prevalence of points in this quadrant here. Let me get the green little pointer here to work. I'm trying to use my mouse, sorry. Right here. And that is indicating an increasing prevalence of drought conditions, and it's mostly driven by increasingly warm temperatures. So precipitation is all over the map in terms of historical climates and climate projections, but the one thing that we're pretty sure about is it's going to get warmer, and that means increasing prevalence of drought. So this is 2015 is basically a peek into what the future is going to look like on a more frequent basis for us. And this is how things have been playing out in California with the drought. One of my current master's students was a student at Fresno State University studying Chinook salmon in this river, the San Joaquin. He decided to move to Oregon after 42 miles of the stream was dried up in the 2015 drought event. So it's a pretty big deal, and it seems to be moving around the country. Another thing that happens when things get hot and dry is wildfires. And this is just up at the top of this slide here is a trace of large fires over time. This is from a recent paper by Tony Westerling. The solid black line is temperature, and the red bars are frequency of large wildfires. And you can see that historically we've got a lot more, relative to the historical record, we've got a lot more large wildfires occurring now, and temperatures are increasing as well. And as you can see in the slide here, these events have fairly significant impacts on streams. And so the questions I have with respect to fires, droughts, and other effects of climate are, how does this influence availability of water across landscapes in streams like this? About 80% of our streams and stream networks are small streams. These are sort of the circulatory systems, the water delivery systems for our larger rivers and the landscape as a whole. We're also interested in stream temperatures because what happens to stream temperature essentially parallels what happens with stream flow permanence. So to start off with, I want to discuss an example of work, a series of projects that we're working on in the Great Basin out west here, and then I will expand to a more regional perspective and ultimately to a national initiative that we're trying to launch now to look at these questions about flow permanence and thermal regimes in these smaller streams. The Great Basin is a great place to do this work. It's characterized by indirect drainages, so none of the rivers here flow to the sea. They're all kind of self-contained. There's a lot of so-called pluvial lake basins. A lot of these places had a lot of water in the Pleistocene. There was a lake across this expanse here that was about the size of Lake Erie 15,000 years ago. The topography is a horse and graben topography, or basin range if you prefer. It's an easy place to work because it's about 80% or more public land, depending where you're at in this geography. And a lot of the Great Basin is a snow-driven hydrology, so it should be fairly climate sensitive. If you want to learn more about the Great Basin, I highly recommend this great book by Don Grayson in the lower left-hand portion of the slide. It's a great sort of background to the region. I want to acknowledge a few specific individuals that are working with me out in the Great Basin, folks in my lab, Mike Heck, Luke Schultz, David Hockman-Wirt, Nate Shelgren, playing key roles. Yvonne Arismendi from Oregon State University, some folks from Trout Unlimited, Dan Dewalter, Kurt Fessmeyer, Helen Neville, and Seth Wenger from the University of Georgia. Also funding from a variety of groups there in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. So why do we care about water in the desert? Well, it's kind of obvious. There are a lot of species that depend on water, a lot of species of conservation concern. So in the upper left-hand corner, there's a shot there of the greater sage-grouse, which is a major DOI species of concern as of late. Other species, though, like mountain quail in the center top there, was proposed for listing, and another water-dependent species, pygmy rabbit, in the upper right. North American beaver, a big species in terms of being an ecosystem engineer and the focus of a lot of restoration efforts out there, including climate adaptation. Columbia spotted frogs, obviously dependent on water, being an amphibian. And then, of course, I'm a fish ecologist, and I always point towards the fish, which don't always get as much attention, but they are the listed species in the Great Basin, and by far the most imperiled because they are completely dependent on water. So what do we know about water in the Great Basin? This is sort of a picture of USGS's flow gauge network across the nation. Don't worry about the colors, that this shows you where they're at in terms of discharge relative to the historic record. But you can just see sort of the concentration of points across the continental U.S., Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and a big concentration of gauges in the east, some along the west coast. And as you move further inland, you can see here in the state of Oregon, we get western Oregon, a lot of gauges here. And once you move out into the Great Basin, hardly anything at all. And when you take a look at the state of Nevada, which hosts a big portion of the Great Basin, you get a lot of gauges up here around Lake Tahoe. But once you get out into the eastern portions of the deserts, very little in terms of gauges. So not a lot of information out there for us to tap into in terms of understanding flow permanence, thermal regimes, and all that kind of stuff. The other challenge with gauges is they're often put up in places where people have a strong interest in using the water. So they're often located on streams or watersheds that are highly altered by human flow regulation. So it's really hard to kind of pull that climate signal out of gauges. And we know from recent work by Tyrell, DeWeber, and others that gauges often don't represent streams in terms of conditions that you see across the landscape. They're kind of a very selective subset of streams that are out there. So gauges are a wonderful source of information, but we can't rely on gauges alone to understand climate change, to understand what's going on across the landscape. We could turn to looking at water temperature. A lot of folks are sampling water temperatures in streams across the nation. This is a lot easier to do. All you need is one of these little instruments like the one pictured here in the slide. That's a little tidbit made by Onset Corporation, but lots of companies making these things these days. Pretty easy to program and drop into the stream. Again, though, if you look at this is just the eastern, or this is the Lahontan Basin here in the Great Basin. Let me get my pointer moving here. It's a little challenge here to use this. So this is the outline of the Lahontan Basin. Again, Lake Tahoe over here, you can see all these little dark points, lots of water temperature sampling here where all the people are, all the water is. Once you get out to the eastern portion, just huge extents of the Great Basin where there's very little information at all, even for these very simple sensors. We can use contemporary spatial statistical models to print for 6 hours in between some of the points that were used to create this model. So we're not sure exactly how reliable these predictions are. The other factor in this part of the world is the issue of flow permanence. And about 80% of the streams in the Great Basin are classified as intermittent, so they don't have water on a year-round basis. So that makes it very challenging as well for predicting water temperature because, in fact, that stream is more likely to be dry. And we'll talk about that more in a second. One of the things that really drew me into this work, I might have mentioned I'm a fish ecologist by training and by practice. One of the things I came to realize working in the Great Basin for over 20 years is that we actually know more about fish than we know about water. We've got about 500 samples of water temperatures in the Lahontan Basin, for example, and we've got over 5,000 samples of fish based on a recent publication of mine. When I realized this, I got a little bit chagrined and decided, wow, maybe we should just start doing more work on water, and we'll get to the fish later. Another interesting issue to bring up here at this point and sort of giving you a little background material is, and a lot of you folks know this, I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, but our stream classifications are often decades out of date. USGS did a wonderful job decades ago in sort of mapping out streams using stereo photographs and pen and paper. This is a great image that Kevin Roth, who was in charge of NHD, now retired but still working with the NHD program, she sent this to me, just an old historical map. And she reminded me that all of the digital NHD that we see these days and we use in our conservation assessments was digitized from maps like this that oftentimes are quite old. We just simply don't have the staff anymore to go out and look at these streams, and these classifications were created probably during a different climate regime than we're experiencing today. So no wonder when we go out in the field we find that these are often incorrect. And folks have looked at this. There's an interesting recent paper by Ken Fritz and a bunch of other folks from EPA. They actually did the work here in Oregon looking at NHD and actual patterns of flow permanence, and what they found here in the state of Oregon is the NHD was about 50% off with respect to classifying perennial streams. And again, I'll talk more about that in a second with the Great Basin and what we found there. So what's the solution? The obvious solution is data. We just simply need more data on patterns of flow permanence and thermal regimes in these streams, so we need to get stuff in the water. We have 3 different types of sensors that we're deploying in streams to collect this data. The first is a temperature logger, so an example here of the onset tidbit. So that can give us, we're putting them in for a full year to get full year thermal regimes and working up some ways to statistically determine when that temperature is telling us when a stream went dry versus when it's got water in it. To back that up, we've got, in a lot of places, we've got electrical resistors deployed in these stream channels, and these are modified thermistors. We basically pull the wires out, disable the thermistor, so this thing is measuring electrical impedance, the ability of the water to conduct electricity, and that gives us basically an off-on signal of wet or dry. And then in a few places we've got instruments like this deployed that can, they're pressure transducers and thermistors, so they can tell us water depth and temperature at the same time. So that's another way to look and tell if a stream has gone dry. And then finally, we pair these instruments up with air temperature sensors in the basin. The correlation between air and water can tell us if a stream is gone dry or not, just based on that diel pattern of variability, and also give us an idea of how stream temperatures and flow permanence are responding to changes in atmospheric conditions as indicated by air temperature patterns. And what we're trying to get at is annual regimes. We want to look at seasonality, seasonal variability among years. We're trying to move away from sort of the 3-stage classification of streams as ephemeral, intermittent, or perennial, and embrace this idea like we have with flow regimes of thinking about flow permanence and thermal regimes in terms of the frequency of events, their timings or phenology, if you will, the duration, how long do they last, and magnitudes. And we know all of these are very important biologically and give us much greater capability to look at the effects of climate on these systems. So we're doing that for thermal regimes, and you can see here's some different descriptors of thermal regimes and streams, the timing, the variability and magnitude. This is just a 2-factor principal components plot, sort of digesting all of these metrics into a couple of scores. And what you can tell from how these different descriptors are arrayed across this graph is that the timing, variability, and magnitude at least are telling us very different things about these streams. So they're all useful descriptors of what's going on. The same logic applies for stream flow permanence. This is an example published by Chris Yeager a couple years ago, again in PNAS. This is the Verde River Basin in central Arizona, and looking at the frequency of zero flow days or events and the duration of those events trying to come up with a more regime-based approach to classifying flow permanence. I think this is where it's all going in the future. So what are we doing in the Great Basin? We've got 2 different types of instrumental networks deployed. At one extent, we're looking across entire large basins. So this is the eastern Lahontan Basin in northern Nevada, and this is a distribution of points that we're hoping to sample using an EMAP GRITS design to look at regional sensitivity of flow permanence and thermal regimes to climatic variability. And then we've got data being collected now in a couple of focal basins, one here in southeast Oregon, the other in north central Nevada. These are really densely instrumented networks, and because of that, we're able to sort of drill down and not only take a look at climate sensitivity, but ask questions about local land and water management and how that influences what's going on in the stream channel. So I'm going to talk about these focal basin studies in the time I have today, because we have more information, more data from that at this time. Here's a close-up of the basin we're studying in southeast Oregon. It's the Willow Whitehorse Basin. It is the world's stronghold for this threatened species, Lahontan cutthroat trout, pictured here. Also a very important place for the greater sage-grouse and a variety of other species, and important for the local permittee who grazes his cows up here. And you can see the black dots in the stream network that indicates where we have these sensors deployed. We've got one about every kilometer in this basin. We've used a modified GRITS design, so things are fairly well spatially distributed in what were classified by NHD as perennial and intermittent streams. You can see the red dotted line around this watershed. This is the perimeter of the 2012 Holloway fire, which burned extensively across here in August of 2012. And of course, up here are the partners that have supported this work. Bureau of Land Management has provided much of the funding, and Trout Unlimited as a key partner here as well. The Trout Creeks and the Willow Whitehorse Basin, the Trout Creek Mountains and the Willow Whitehorse Creeks are a pretty important place. It's one of the first examples we have of ranchers working collaboratively with land managers and other partners in the region to get the grazing right. And I want to give credit to Doc and Connie Hatfield, who were the originals involved in the Trout Creek Working Group, and then this involved the former Secretary of the Interior, Bruce Babbitt, and all of that back in the 90s. And it's been a real success story. We've gone from a fairly overgrazed situation to really nice-looking riparian zones like this in lower Willow Creek. So it's a great example to be working in. Unfortunately, the Holloway fire, which burned this area in 2012, really changed the story, at least temporarily. You can see the pre-fire condition, just an example of what that riparian zone looked like pre-fire and then post-fire. It's a pretty clear picture of what happened. Everything got really burned quite severely. So the BLM is very interested in trying to understand the post-fire response of these systems. It turns out that we had temperature loggers in the stream before the fire, so we have the capability to look at pre-post-fire changes in stream conditions, and they're interested in using this information for their grazing management. After a wildfire, the BLM can call a halt to grazing for a certain time period until upland vegetation recovers. They've never really been able to consider how streams recover and what that appropriate recovery time frame might be like. So that's what we're looking into in the study in part. And here's a picture of one of our temperature loggers just to give you a sense of how hot that fire was, at least in some places. This logger was protected by a PVC shield. We actually got data from this thing, but I'm not sure I'm really going to trust it. I won't talk about that today, but it takes a lot of heat to burn PVC like that. Here's a place where we got good data back before and after the fire. This is just sort of a zoom in of the immediate effects of this wildfire on stream temperatures, what you see immediately before the Holloway fire is that maximum temperatures here in the red, average, and minimums are tracking each other fairly closely. Right after the fire, the maximum temperatures really shot up several degrees. The mean just a little bit, and the minimums pretty much stayed the same. So we're interested over time, sort of moving out along this x-axis to understand how long it takes these systems to recover. So this is a little more of a confusing plot here. Here's the vertical line indicating the date of the Holloway fire, maximum temperatures in red, average in green, and minimums in blue. And we're tracking these temperatures over several years from 2012 up to 2016, try to get a better understanding of what's happening in terms of summer heating in the wake of this fire and the recovery of the riparian zone. Winter cooling, with that loss of that riparian vegetation, we might see more radiative heat loss in the winter. Nobody's ever looked at that. We might see more freezing, which is a big deal. Sometimes I wonder if freezing is more important than warm summer temperatures in this part of the world, in this cold Great Basin desert. Then also interested in the duration, the number of years of responses. So we're right in the middle of that statistical analysis now, conducting a pre-post fire comparison with an unburned reference site, a stream that's a few kilometers down the road that has a very comparable time series. And we're going to be publishing that hopefully this next year. So that's what we're looking at in terms of temperature in the system in part. We're also trying to diagnose stream drying. So I mentioned before that we have these resistors deployed in the stream network. They're paired up with these temperature loggers, so we'll know exactly when streams go dry and how that's reflected in the temperature record. And what we're trying to do here is develop some statistical filters to diagnose when a stream goes dry based on temperature alone. So in the future, we only have to use one instrument to determine thermal regimes and drying at the same time. And here's an example of what these data look like for the first year of data from Willow and Whitehorse Creeks. The blue trace over time is water temperature. The red trace is the reading from the resistor. And the resistor is essentially just indicating presence or absence of water. What you see at this particular site is that it was dry until about February of this year. Then it got wet. You can see an immediate change in the thermal regime that's recorded by the sensor that's sitting in that stream channel. And of course, an immediate response of the resistor indicating that there is now electrical connectivity in that system. Then it dries fairly abruptly in July, and you can see the variance in the temperature increasing dramatically right after that transition from water to air. There's a few blips here in the resistor, and I think that's probably because there's some moisture inside the resistor. Things aren't perfect when you put them in a stream for a full year. It's kind of like what happened to my cell phone last year when I dropped it in the river. It took forever to dry out, so that's probably what's going on here with this resistor. But anyhow, a pretty reliable indicator of stream drying. We're also conducting some experiments. We have some experimental stream channels to the west of us here at the Oregon Hatchery Research Center, and experimentally drying these channels to see what happens to temperature under more controlled conditions. Here's one of our field assistants essentially watching a stream dry all day. Not the most exciting thing, but it's something we got to do to validate the use of this approach. Here's 3 sites for over time in Willow Whitehorse Creeks, just giving you a picture of what months they were dry and what months they were wet. Anything that's green in this picture is probably dry. That question mark's just based on some of the small wobbles in the resistor, but I'm pretty sure that means they were dry. And the bottom line from these 3 sites is you can see that all 3 were wet in June of that year. It probably corresponds to runoff snowmelt. But beyond that, these sites are completely different. The site up top was more dry during the winter than it was in the spring and summer. It was dry for the full months of December through April. The middle stream, you can see it was dry in the fall, but then wet in the winter, kind of almost the opposite, and then it started to dry again in August of that year. Then the site at the bottom was wet all year, except for August when it started to dry up a little bit for part of that month. So very different behaviors at these three sites in the same stream network. Another interesting thing to look at with these data that we have the capability to look at a super useful model. You can see the streamlines here for Willow Whitehorse Creeks and the Norwest predicted mean water temperatures from a data set that was collated from 1993 to 2011. This was just before the Holloway fire in 2012, so this is a really great baseline for us to compare our observed temperatures to. And here are the points that we sampled over the 2015 water year. We're looking at the observed August mean temperatures, and we've overlaid those on the Norwest predicted August means. And what you can see here, just from a quick visual inspection, is that oftentimes the colors of the dots and the lines are different, and that means that the observed August mean in 2015 is different from that 1993 to 2011 baseline, and different quite a bit of the time, actually. The other thing to notice here is a lot of these sites are dry. The black diamonds indicate sites that we found to be dry, and when we went out and retrieved these loggers. So Norwest itself, just by virtue of the statistical model that it uses, it has to force streamlines through networks in order for the model to fit. So it'll give you a prediction of temperature even when there is no water in a channel. And so we're just trying to add to what you can get out of Norwest by understanding where you actually have water. If we take a look at the observed minus predicted temperatures for this comparison that I just showed you, you can see here we've got just residuals between indicating the observed minus predicted. So a positive means that our 2015 temperature was warmer than would be expected based on the Norwest baseline, and then a negative is colder than expected. And remember, 2015 was a pretty strong drought year, as well as a post-fire year. And fire and drought tend to happen together in this country. When things get hot and dry, they also burn, as I indicated in the background to this presentation. And what you see in this particular data set is of the total number of sites we had, about 35 of those had water temperatures that were warmer than the baseline for Norwest. Although a lot of these sites, the differences weren't that big, less than a degree difference, which I really don't consider to be that big of a deal. But interestingly enough, there were several sites actually that got colder during the drought rather than warmer. So a very non-uniform response to the drought that we never would have known had we not had these instruments out there cooking away in this sort of intensive deployment. The other important thing to notice, about half the sites were dry. If we look at these deviations, so it's the same scale on the y-axis on this graph as a function of elevation on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we can see that it appears to be a function of elevation. So the higher up you get in the watershed, the more likely you are to see streams that get colder in a time of drought versus warmer, which is more likely downstream. We're not sure exactly why this is. It probably has something to do with groundwater. Groundwater temperatures are related to mean annual air temperatures, so that's certainly a contributor. The other thing that's a possibility is when you have more streams wet, in the case of a condition that's not a drought, there's more of that flow path that's exposed to the sun and could potentially heat up. So a little bit counterintuitive, but results like this make us think harder about what's really going on in these stream networks in response to drought. And the bottom line is a very common theme in a lot of the climate change work that I've done in my career. Local variability is really playing an important role here. In terms of stream classifications, just a few examples. Our results were very similar to the work by Ken Fritz, about 50% off. Here's a few streams that were classified as perennial in this network and absolutely bone dry at the time of our sampling in August. And here's a few intermittent streams. These look more to me like ephemeral streams, ones that barely have water except when it's really raining hard. Some of these look like they've never had water. And these are also portions of the Northwest stream temperature network. They have a predicted August mean water temperature of 14 to 16 degrees, but of course there's no water at all. Classification table here, just giving you a summary of how our observations comported with the NHDE classification. And what you can see here is we're pretty far off. It's not a big surprise. I'm not trashing NHD. It's a great program. It's just, we can't do all of the work to get out there and find these streams and accurately classify them. But we're off about a third of the time in this particular system, a third to half of the time in terms of accurately classifying streams as perennial. A lot of times they're actually dry in reality. For intermittent streams during this time of the year, most of the streams are dry, very few are wet. And in fact, those might be perennial streams, I'm not sure. That was a result from 2014, basically the same result from 2015. In terms of trout distribution, I mentioned before that this watershed is the world stronghold for this species, threatened lahont cutthroat trout. You can see in the stream network the heavy lines indicate places where trout are known to occur. The thinner lines are places where trout are absent. And during that drought of 2015, most of the watershed was too hot for the species if you go with the EPA criterion for this fish, which is less than 20 degrees. So only the dark blue dots here conform with that criterion. All the rest of them are too warm. So just a few places in the tippity tops of the stream network were cold enough for the species during the drought. And you can also see, even in some of these cold places, that there was no water. It dried up. So a real dramatic response of this watershed to drought, very climate sensitive, and this is consistent with some of our past research on the species, is that it can look good now, but when things change, like in the case of this drought, very sensitive. So what's next? We've got a lot of work to do in terms of continuing to deploy these instruments and streams in as many places as we can put them for as many years as we can sustain this effort. Again, it's really remarkable to me that we know more about fish than we know about water, and I'm hoping in about 10 years that we'll know more about water. It's important for everything out there in the Great Basin. After we write up the initial results of what I showed you today, the next step is to take a more detailed look at how these in-stream responses are changing in response to the riparian zone. So we've been working closely with Trout Unlimited. They've been able to interpret NAPE imagery to classify riparian zones. You can see an example here in the upper left-hand corner of this slide. Let me get my pointer here. I can't get my pointer to work, but in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a shot from 1991 in this particular stream reach, very thin riparian zone, very underdeveloped. And after improving the grazing management on this particular allotment, 2013, you can see a much more well-developed riparian zone. There's my arrow. It was in a riparian zone. Couldn't find it. You can see much more developed riparian, and actually, if you look closely here, there's some little discontinuities in the water. These are actually beaver dams, beaver ponds that have formed extensive wetlands in these systems, which is really neat to see. Oh, there's a close-up of what I'm talking about here. So 1991 versus 2013, pretty obvious change. How's that translating into what's happening in the stream channel in terms of thermal regimes and flow permanence? That's what we're going to be able to look at next with all of these data that we've been collecting. Here's a picture of what it looks like on the ground. I showed this to you before. This place was basically a sagebrush plain before grazing management improvements, and now beaver have come in here, and this place has become a giant wetland. So that's a good deal. It looks nice. But we have questions about how these beaver dams, beaver structures are contributing to late season low flows in these systems, as well as temperatures. It could be the case that temperatures might cool down because of increased connectivity with subsurface hyporheic or groundwater, or in a lot of cases, beaver dams warm up streams, and it may not be that good if the climate is warming or if we're going to be experiencing more droughts. So a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainties, and we'll be able to address those with these data for the first time in a network context. I get the question from managers in this region, what are we going to do with these data? So I've been working with them to identify the uses, and I guess the main question is, what are they not useful for? They're totally useful for evaluating beaver and riparian restoration, water and wildlife. Lots of species like sage-grouse and many others absolutely dependent on access to water. Stream classifications, updating sort of the ephemeral, intermittent, perennial classification, coming up with new classifications, all absolutely critical in terms of determining what sorts of land management are appropriate. For example, where you can drop fire retardants, apply pesticides, where the Clean Water Act is implemented, what are the waters of the nation. All that depends on your stream classification. And then grazing is an important use, and how that interacts with wildfire, like I talked about, a major management issue. And of course, fish and amphibians, absolutely dependent on water. Outside of the Great Basin, just wanted to mention a couple of other things that are in the works, and kind of giving you a preview of this so you have a chance to give us some feedback before we do the work, rather than me coming at the end and showing you what we did with no chance to change it. So we recently got funding from the Northwest Climate Science Center here in Oregon to develop a regional model of intermittency, so not just the Great Basin, but east side, west side, all forest types across the region. And this is a collaboration between multiple USGS centers, water centers, and FRASC in this region, as well as Dan Walter, Trout Unlimited, and Dan and I are partially funded by NASA to do this work. This is just a preliminary distribution of points in the 3 states where we're going to focus our efforts, and we've basically been getting data from anyone who's been out sampling streams and is keeping tabs on whether that stream was found to be wet or dry at the time of sampling. So this real concentration of points down here in southeast Oregon is part of a red band trout survey where they kept track of flow permanence, so super useful for us. A variety of other efforts, thousands of points that we're putting together across the region to take a look at flow permanence. And one of the main things we're interested in is following up on this paper by Roy Sando and Kyle Blosch. They published a paper last year looking at predicting headwater stream intermittency in alpine streams in western Montana. And what they found was flow permanence was strongly a function of snowpack persistence. So if you had a snowpack that lasted late into the spring into early summer, those were the streams that were more likely to be found to be perennial, flowing throughout the year. Geology and some other factors had an important influence as well, but snow was the big driver, and knowing how sensitive that's going to be to climate change going to be a big focus here in the region. Okay, zooming out a little bit further, this project is not yet funded, but we're going to keep working on it until it is. We're writing a proposal right now to develop some citizen science applications focusing in national parks, because they're all about visitors, so do a wonderful job with that. And we're trying to develop some smartphone-based applications for visitors to parks to track patterns of flow permanence. And the motivation behind this, number one, parks are great with working with visitors. Number two, they're potentially good bellwethers for tracking the effects of climate change, because they're relatively unaltered, at least many of them are relatively well-protected landscapes. So we can factor out sort of that human influence is such a problem, like for gauges, for example. The other thing is we simply just don't have the human power to do this work. It's very expensive to hire crews, to purchase instruments, and to deal with all of those data for projects like we're doing in the Great Basin. The reason we're doing more of a scientist-forward approach in the Great Basin is there are no citizens in the Great Basin. There aren't that many people out there, not enough folks to really sort of drive the bus, but parks are pretty amazing. They have only 22,000 employees nationwide, but they have over 220,000 volunteers that work in our parks, and over 300 million visitors in 2015. So there's quite a workforce there, as long as we give them the tools to contribute to understanding flow permanence. And here's some of the applications that we're looking at, some of these smartphone apps. One is iNaturalist, which the parks have already formally adopted. They're using that quite extensively during their centennial year. The map at the bottom of the slide is just a global distribution of iNaturalist observations. There's about 2 million across the globe so far. Then there are some more specific applications, like this one called Creek Watch, which is geared towards taking a photograph of a stream and responding to a very simple survey, which is then downloaded to a geodatabase online automatically to give you a sense of what's going on. And so we're going to look at some sort of application that's in between iNaturalist and Creek Watch to get this work done with the visitors to these parks. And I will say I used iNaturalist myself the other day. I found a rare species here locally in Corvallis, the sharp-tailed snake. I'd never seen one in my whole life, and I was able to download the application, take a picture of the snake, and see my observation on iNaturalist in the space of about 10 minutes. So very easy to use, and really optimistic about applying this to documenting what's happening in streams and parks. And here's just another example of what's going on in the parks right now with iNaturalist. This is sponsored in part by National Geographic. So this map is just showing you the park properties in which they've hosted what they call a BioBlitz, and this is basically a whole bunch of people that go out with their cameras and use iNaturalist to document what kinds of species they see in parks, and a lot of times they're finding things that have never been documented in the park itself. So it's a pretty cool application. It seems like a real logical extension to apply something like this to water. And we've proposed not calling these BioBlitzes, but Drought Blitzes. This is named after the Trout Blitz program in Trout Unlimited, so I'll give Helen Neville credit for coming up with that name. Main questions we have in this project, obviously we've got to get parks and citizens to participate, so that's part of the study. What affects where people record data, and when we get those data, what is the quality of those relative to the instrumental record? So there's a comparative component there to sort of validate QA/QC on the information that we get. Because we are applying to NASA for this particular funding, and we do this anyway, even if it wasn't NASA, we want to link these responses that we're observing in parks to satellite products like MODIS, land surface temperature, or snow. I showed you in the Sando and Blasch paper that snow is a real big driver of flow permanence, so we want to keep tabs on that with the data that we're getting from citizens, and look at the value of that for modeling climate sensitivity, and essentially taking what I call the hydrologic pulse of national parks. Okay, that's all I've got to say. Again, I want to really express my gratitude to the many partners who have joined us in contributing to this effort, and particularly in the Great Basin. It's not easy work collecting these data. Here's one of our main partners, Todd Alai with the BLM. I hiked into this canyon with him to drop off a couple of temperature loggers, and we literally hiked from the stream bed up to that ridge top to get this done. So it's not easy, and I really appreciate the effort. And I'm not going to conclude with the end. You guys are really sort of in on the beginning of this work, so I'm really looking forward to your questions and feedback, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jason. Excellent presentation. Thank you. All right, we have a few minutes for questions. Yes, Matt. And then
Okay. Jason, Matt Obradovich from Burns here, and I was noticing on some of your maps where you were in the Willow and White Horse drainages, you had you know, your resistors out there measuring wet or dry. Were there, I guess, in any of those, did you have any observations, like in between where you had dry points, were there still small areas of flowing water? Like with your picture here, you're showing, you know, flowing or standing water anyway to a certain point, and then it disappears. And a lot of our streams, like in this part of the Great Basin, may, you know, run for a distance and then disappear underground, pop up someplace else. Did you try to, I guess, correlate where you had your resistors with some of those that were permanent flow dry, so that you're capturing some of that in the data?
We take field notes on that, but it's a real tough issue with field sampling, and we debated that a lot at the beginning of this particular project. So the picture you see here on the screen is a great example of that. You know, if you move your instrument just a few inches, you're going to get a completely different reading on flow permanence. And so what we decided to do was, you know, send our crews to a specific geocoordinate in a stream network, and then they're asked to walk a random offset, you know, in terms of meters up or downstream to locate that point. So it's a random sample, and it's a point sample. And so that's, you know, that's giving us more of a probabilistic sample of the whole network, and you know, we're not going to be able to pick up these little details. We could, for example, in the Park Service work where there's a lot more folks, you know, maybe volunteers who are willing to walk the entire stream and map it out. That's a tough thing to do. That's a good question.
Yeah, well, I was just wondering, you know, as far as where you're, you know, like you say, we have a lot more data on where fish are, but, you know, in some of these streams where you lose reaches, you know, you may have fish still upstream from where it goes underground, or you may have fish, you know, down below where it resurfaces, and just wondering if you were trying to correlate any of that with your temperature and wet and dry.
We will, and just kind of keep it short, you know, with the fish, it's super important in that wetting and drying of the network. You know, how does that link to what fish are doing in the stream? Are fish you see in the summer when the flows are fairly low, is there abundance or body size? Is that more of a product of what happened in the spring in terms of how that water was spread across the landscape versus, you know, the time that you're out there sampling? And then what are the implications of that spatial temporal flow permanence for the ability of these fish to move around and persist in the face of climate change. We've got a postdoc working on that with some individual-based models now as part of another NASA study we have going on.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes and 2 more questions right now. From Wade, he says, thank you very much for presenting. It's my understanding that the Creek Watch app is no longer supported. So would your efforts with the National Park Service restart the Creek Watch app?
Yes, it would be something like Creek Watch, and Creek Watch was only available for iPhones, I believe, so we'd have somebody put something together for a variety of platforms, Android, Windows phones, iPhones, that kind of thing. Yes.
Excellent, thank you. And then Jim asks, the additional groundwater to a stream will definitely affect the stream temperature. Does this show up as a stabilizing effect?
Absolutely. That's an awesome question. Yeah, that's a technical detail I skipped over. Yes, and looking at patterns of gaining and losing in the network and how that's dampening the diel variation could be a really important diagnostic for groundwater. Cool. Thanks for bringing that up.
Excellent. Thank you very much again for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.